Hey everybody, Doug here. I wanted to do kind of a special video here today and talk about one of the challenges that I've run into in quite a few times in the last few years in doing live video production, and I'm sure others have as well. In fact, I've seen quite a few people talk about it on my Discord as well as Facebook, and that is getting Mac laptops to cooperate with the video production system, get video that's being output from the Mac into our switchers. It seems that when Apple came out with Apple Silicon-based machines a few years ago, the M1, M2, M3, etc., that they changed the way they handle the HDMI outputs on their machines, and they can be unpredictable, maybe the best way of saying it, in terms of getting that HDMI output to cooperate with our video production system. So I wanted to go through some of the challenges and some of the possible solutions that I found that actually can be made to work. One of the things that I wanted to say though before I jump right in though is that there's no guarantee that these things will work. I'd say these things tend to have a mind of their own, and even after going through all the steps that I'm going to talk about here today, you might find that you're not able to get output on your Mac consistently, and sometimes there's nothing you can do, unfortunately. So anyway, so the big challenge that we have is that we find that sometimes just these Macs will just not cooperate when it comes to getting video out of the HDMI or USB-C, particularly the USB-C outputs, and getting it into our ATEM switchers. And let's kind of go over some of what those challenges are and why this is more difficult than it is on a Windows PC, for example. Now, before I get into the solutions, I want to talk a little bit about why this is actually a problem and what's kind of causing it behind the scenes, and that has to do with a couple different things that are happening, particularly with Macs, that don't necessarily happen on other types of computers. First of all, the Macs will choose to output whatever resolution they're going to choose to output, and there's nothing you can do to change it. It's just going to basically negotiate with the connected device, and whatever the highest resolution and frame rate that device will support, that's what your Mac is going to output. And it doesn't matter what you do in the system settings, displays, control panel, it's going to always output that, and I'll demonstrate that here in a minute. But the other one, and this is something that's only happened in the last few years since the Apple Silicon Macs came out, and I've heard this from some engineers who work for a major video production equipment manufacturer, that the signal timings on Mac's HDMI outputs are non-standard, and they're not following the official standards for HDMI in terms of exactly what the frame rates and then the individual scan lines, how those are output, and like the frequency of the changing from one sample to the next, basically. And so since they're not outputting a non-standard signal, if you got a piece of equipment that's even a little bit picky about those timings, that you're basically going to get no output whatsoever. But on top of that, it seems to vary from one computer to the next. Like, some people have Macs that always work, but I've also run into situations where there's some Macs out there that never work, and so your mileage may vary based on what computer you're actually trying to work with, and I'll talk a little bit about that here at the end as well. But I'm just going to kind of want to demonstrate what some of this looks like and what some of the things that we can actually do about this. But one thing I want to mention though is, like, I know a lot of people who are going to be watching this, you have switchers that will do frame rate and scaling on the inputs. Most of the ATEMs nowadays are capable of doing that, and in a lot of situations that will save you and allow you to get a computer to work. So even though your computer might be outputting at 60 frames per second and your switcher is at 30, the switcher will automatically do a conversion for you, and so it just works. It just looks okay. At least you're getting a picture. But I would submit that you probably don't want to do that if you've got any sort of control over the situation. And the reason for that is, like, anytime you do any sort of conversion of a signal from one format to another, you're going to be losing something. For example, if you're converting from 4K down to HD, obviously it's going to be losing resolution. You're going to be losing clarity, and the converters in the ATEMs are not the best in terms of preserving quality when you do that conversion. So it's always better to make sure that your computer is outputting at the same resolution that your switcher is running, so you're avoiding that particular conversion as well. In terms of frame rates, those are particularly problematic. So even though you can get a signal that works, you introduce some very strange artifacts. So anytime you've got any sort of motion going on the screen, it will come out and be very uneven, be very jumpy, and will just not look good. It's going to be very distracting, particularly if it goes through a handful of conversions. So if you're running your switcher at 30 frames per second and your computer's running at 60 and you go to YouTube and you play a video that's running at 24 frames per second, your output is going to be an absolute mess at that point. So avoiding all those conversions, if you possibly can, is going to give you a much higher quality output that's going to look just so much better than it will if it's going through any sort of conversion. All right, the first thing that I wanted to mention is that the HDMI port and the USB-C ports on Macs actually behave a little bit differently, and so if you're running into a problem with one port, you can always try the other. I've found that the HDMI ports on the Macs that have them are a little bit more predictable, a little more reliable in terms of getting output than the USB-C outputs. And so if you're working with a computer, the MacBook Pros in particular, that actually does have an HDMI output, you're probably going to find that you're going to have better luck with that than you do with the USB-C. I know a lot of Macs don't actually have HDMI, like for the Airs in particular don't have an dedicated HDMI output on them, and so you're stuck with USB-C. But there's some things that we can do, and I'll get to some of those here in a little bit in order to give you a higher chance of success in order to get those to work. Alright, so I am using the latest M3 MacBook Pro. This is the 14-inch model. It's about basically $2,000. And I'm running the latest version of macOS that's available, so it's fully up to date. Everything is current. I'm running here in the displays portion of the system settings, and we've got these settings here that appear to allow you to change the resolution that's being output by the Mac, but unfortunately they don't. So if I take a look at my decimator, so I've got my decimator hooked up here, and it has a display on there, and it says what signal it's receiving. In this case, it's receiving a signal that is 6G 2160 30p. Well, my switcher is running 2160 at 29.97, so the frame rate's a little bit different. And then even though it's a small difference, it's enough that my switcher would not allow me to display a signal whatsoever. So it'd be nice to be able to change that. But as I notice here, as I hover over this, it's saying it's running at 1920 by 1080. And what that's actually saying is it's emulating 1980 or 1920 by 1080. It's not actually outputting at that resolution. So I can click one of these other ones here, and it does change the size of things on screen. So it looks like it might be a different resolution, but in reality, the output on the HDMI port of the Mac is actually the same no matter which of these I choose. So I can go over here all the way to the smallest one where text is basically microscopic, and it's still exactly the same resolution as if I click on the largest one here, which is allegedly 1920 by 1080. For every one of these, it's outputting 3840 by 2160, currently at 30 frames per second. Now we do have some control over the frame rate that's being output, so we have refresh rate option here, so I can for example take that back to 60 where it defaulted originally when I first hooked it up, and it does honor that setting. But you also notice that in this list you're not finding the NTSC style frame rates of like 29.97 or 59.94 or 23.976, and that actually is a problem. So the fact that you're getting a mismatch between what your switcher is expecting and what the computer is sending means you're going to have occasional jumps in the frames that are being displayed as part of your video output. So it would be better if you could force it in order to go with those reduced frame rates, but unfortunately there's no way that I've ever found in order to make macOS do that. So we're inherently living with some limitations here that make things a little bit difficult. Now if I was running my switcher at 1080p and the Mac chooses to output 4K because the converter that I'm using happens to support 4K, then the switcher is going to be receiving a 4K signal that it can't understand. And there's nothing you can do in software to change that. It's just the way that macOS happens to work today. So we need to come up with some other solutions in order to sort of nudge it in the right direction and get it to output the signal that we actually want. In addition, sometimes the Mac just refuses to cooperate and it will output a signal that our equipment can't even understand. And there's a few things we can do in order to work around that as well, and I wanted to address that here as well. So if there's nothing we can do in software on the Mac in order to make it work consistently, what can we do in hardware to make that work? And fortunately there are some solutions to this problem, and they're actually pretty inexpensive. So unfortunately it's not just as simple as grabbing a USB-C to HDMI cable. That's not going to solve the problem. We also need to add some additional hardware into the mix in order to make it cooperate. So I've got here in front of me, these devices are called EDID emulators. That's EDID. I've got that here popping up on your screen. And what these things do is they basically interrupt that communication that happens between the computer and the connected device, and in order to tell the computer, it's like, hey, I only can understand one particular screen resolution and frame rate. And so basically the Mac is forced to comply by plugging one of these things into the signal chain. So what we want to do with one of these things is we'll grab one of these things and we'll actually take and we're going to insert it in the signal chain between the computer and the receiving device. So I'm going to go ahead and unplug the HDMI cable coming out of there, put this on the end of the HDMI cable, and then I will plug that back in. And what we're going to find is that now the Mac is outputting at a different frame rate and resolution. I'll give that a minute here to finally decide to behave and cooperate. Okay, there we go. So that just took a moment for it to detect and take effect. So now my Mac is outputting a signal that's 1080p at 60 frames per second. So, you know, for example, if I wasn't running 4K on my switcher, I was running 1080p, and I needed to get the signal out of the computer to be 1080p. You can insert one of these things in the signal chain, and there you can see that at the top of your frame, and that will basically tell the Mac the only signal format that I know how to understand is 1080p 60 frames per second. So therefore the Mac actually does comply and give you that resolution that you're wanting. Now, I keep a handful of these things around. Each one is programmed with a different resolution and frame rate. So for example, I forget which one it is, but one of these I have programmed for 1080p at 24 frames per second. So if I'm shooting an event where we're shooting 24 frames, then I can take one of these things, pop that in the computer, and all of a sudden the computer is outputting at that native 24. So it allows us to have a little bit of control over what the Mac is doing and give us a higher likelihood of success in terms of getting a signal from a Mac into a video production system. Now, taking a look at Amazon here, we can see that there's quite a number of different offerings, and they're pretty inexpensive. You can see like some of these are like $8 or $10 in a lot of cases. There's not a whole lot of difference between them, but you notice for each one of them that they're going to be outputting a specific resolution and frame rate. So this one right here, 3840 by 2160 at 59 Hertz. Now, unfortunately, Macs don't honor that frame rate exactly, so even though the EDID emulator is telling the Mac to output 59.94, it's actually still going to output at 60. It doesn't seem capable of outputting at those 59.94 or 29.97 or whatever. So it gets you close, but it isn't necessarily going to be an exact match. I've recently just purchased a 5-pack of these things. I think it was for $20. So they can be pretty inexpensive. I wanted to call out one in particular. It's ones that are from the company called GoFanco. It's the Prophecy line. So they've got these here. This one is, so they're a little bit more money than some of the other ones, but they have the unique ability to be reprogrammed. So if you wanted to choose a resolution or frame rate that they don't sell, you can buy this EDID writer here, and it will actually allow you to program whatever resolution and frame rate you happen to want on your own. So that's one option that you can go with, and I've done that, and it does work. Aside from the 59.94 versus 60 frames per second, it does generally let you choose the resolution and frame rate for a particular device. So anyway, they're pretty inexpensive, and in fact I've got links popping up to those and also in the description down below. So you can pick those up and just have those in your arsenal of equipment, troubleshooting devices, and they will definitely come in handy at one point or another. Alright, the next thing that I wanted to mention is that we can use a different type of cable in order to connect our computers to our video production system and have better luck than some of the less expensive options that are out there. So most of the time, if we're dealing with a computer that only has USB-C, we can grab one of these little inexpensive adapters. It just goes USB-C to HDMI, and those will work. And the way those work is they basically tell the computer, it's like, hey, use some of your extra USB pins to give me an HDMI signal, and then it's able to pass that through. These cables don't actually do any sort of conversion at all. They're just telling the computer what signal type you want, and that's reliant on the computer to generate that type of signal. Well, unfortunately with the Mac, sometimes it generates a signal that's just not readable by a connected device, and so you end up with nothing on your screen. Well, there's another version of a cable that's like this that actually will work better, and that is something that's called an active cable. So I've got this one here. Unfortunately, I misplaced it, so I can't physically show it to you, but this is a cable it's called an active cable, and you see it here in the title. It says HDMI active cable. The difference between this cable and another one is that this one, instead of telling the computer, hey, send me an HDMI signal, it actually tells the computer, send me a DisplayPort signal instead, and then the cable actually does the conversion from DisplayPort to HDMI. They are different signal types, and the cable does the conversion for you. That's why they call it an active cable. It's not just passing the signal from the computer straight through to the output. It's actually generating a signal of its own. And because it is generating a signal of its own, that signal is much more compliant with the standards that are out there, and it's going to be recognized by a lot more devices than the native HDMI signal that's generated by the Mac is capable of doing. I've had one of these cables for several years now, and I've had very high degree of success with it in situations where I've needed to get the output of a Mac to go into a video production system. So this is a solution that I keep with me at every video event, although unfortunately I've misplaced my cable at the moment. I don't know where I've put it, so I can't physically show it to you, but I can tell you, having used this cable for a couple years now, that this works a lot better than the much less expensive passive cables that we're used to using on our USB-C outputs. The next one that I wanted to mention that has worked for me a number of times is an HDMI splitter, and let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is just a standard, inexpensive HDMI splitter. You can get these things anywhere online, but I found that I really like this one from Oray quite a bit. So what we end up doing with this is we do physically split the signal between coming from the Mac into two different outputs. So what happens is we take HDMI output 1 and we run that into a monitor or television or whatever, and then we take output 2 and run that into our video production system. And effectively what happens there is the computer is negotiating with the television for that EDID information rather than our video production system. And I find that that actually generates a much higher degree of success, particularly with 4K, just because it's working with a device type that Apple has tested. And basically what you're getting is you're getting the second HDMI output on here for free, and that's the one that you run into your video production system, and you're able to get a working signal that way. So if nothing else works in a particular situation, you can always take an HDMI splitter like this, add that to the signal chain, and again, I've had a very high degree of success doing it that way instead of trying to make a direct connection from the HDMI on the Mac to a converter. So another tool to add to your arsenal. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to mention, and this is one that you should probably include in every situation, even if you're able to get the Mac to properly talk to an HDMI input on a switcher or an expensive HDMI to SDI converter or whatever, you probably want to have in your arsenal somewhere a proper frame rate converter and scaler, because again, you're probably going to run into situations where you're not able to get the Mac to output the exact right signal that you want in your video production system. And unfortunately, the conversion that's in ATEM is just okay. It's not great. So if you're able to since you have to do a conversion anyway in most situations, if you've got an option to do a higher quality conversion, and that it makes sense to do so. Now I have right here in front of me, this is a Blackmagic Teranex AV. This is about as good as you're going to get without spending absolute ridiculous amounts of money in terms of the quality of the signal. So this does an amazing job of not only scaling for different resolutions, but also converting frame rates from one to another. It's able to do sub-pixel analyzing of the data in order to provide a much higher quality signal than you get with something that's much less expensive. So, I mean, this is going to be kind of your gold standard for anything that's affordable and something that can be run in real time instead of using something like AI or whatever to do conversion in post. But for real-time live events, this is going to be kind of your best option without getting into absolute ridiculous amounts of money. So having one of these things around is going to help an awful lot. If this is not an option for you, then there's a few others that we can talk about as well. We've got the decimator. In this case, it's a 12G cross, but the MDHX is going to be just as good for anytime you're working in HD. It's going to do just as well as the 12G, and that's going to be a higher quality conversion than you get from your ATEM as well. It's not perfect, but it's better than what the ATEM supports natively, so it's something that I would recommend having in your equipment arsenal, and something that you carry along with you to every video event that you happen to be working. So keep one of those things around and use this to do any sort of necessary conversions. You want to get the Mac as close as you possibly can to the resolution and frame rate that your switcher is operating in. then you can use this for that last mile and do the final conversion from HDMI to SDI if you need to, or just for frame rate conversion. So particularly going from like 60 to 5994, this will do a great job of that, and you should be in good shape. Now, short of that, there's also a version from Blackmagic as well. This is the up-down cross HD. So this is one of their mini converters, and you got your HDMI input over here, your SDI outputs here, and this will convert different frame rates and resolutions as well. You've got all your different output formats here on the bottom, and you just choose the settings on these dip switches in order to set the output resolution and frame rate to match your switcher. So of the options that I've shown, this is going to be the lowest quality, this is going to be better, and then of course the Terranex is going to be your best option there. But really the bottom line here is that having an external converter box that's doing that final conversion before it goes into your switcher is going to give you a much higher quality signal than you're going to get with the ATEM native converters. And so it's a good thing to keep these things in your arsenal of equipment, your tool bag, whatever, and allow you to do a better job of doing that final conversion, since it has to be done anyway. And so I very highly recommend keeping at least a couple of these things around. Okay, so there it is. Inevitably, all of us have to work with Macs when it comes to live video production at one time or another if we don't use them on a regular, consistent basis. And so being equipped and having some additional tools, knowing and understanding a little bit more about what's going on can certainly help out quite a lot. And unfortunately, the one thing that I have to mention is even when you've tried all these things, there's going to be situations where nothing works, and so you're probably going to want to have some kind of backup plan, whether that be an additional Mac or a way to do PowerPoint or whatever on a Windows PC. But having some sort of backup in addition to having that primary source on the Mac, you're going to be better off, and you're going to save yourself a ton of time and effort. I did an event just a few weeks ago where a presenter brought a MacBook Air. It was a recent model, and it worked fine. You plug it into a monitor, but there was nothing we could do in order to make it talk to our video production system. We tried everything. We tried every type of cable. We tried every type of converter. We tried going through, we tried doing the HDMI splitter. We tried going through a separate monitor that had an HDMI output. Nothing worked. There was nothing we could do to make that computer display a video signal, and we spent more than an hour trying, and ultimately we had to give up, and we went to a backup computer. And so these things do happen. It's not something that's outside the realm of possibility, and you're going to want to be prepared for those situations because they do come up. So anyway, there you go. If you have any questions about any of this, you can leave those in the comment section down below, or even better, join me over on Discord. The link for that popping up there on your screen. And a whole community of people who work in video production who are there and who are eager to help and know a lot more about this stuff than I do. So feel free to jump in and ask questions there. If you're going to purchase any of these products, I would appreciate using the links that have popped up throughout the course of the video. Those are Amazon affiliate links, and they do help the channel quite a lot, and it's very much appreciated that you do so. Alright, so that's going to about do it for now. So thanks everybody for watching, and have a fantastic day.